Putin could not allow that blatant challenge by Prigozhin, even given that Prigozhin had eventually backed down, had come to his senses, turned the column around that was en route to Moscow within a couple hundred miles of it. That could not be allowed to stand.
Vladimir Putin gave his first public reaction to the reported death of his former ally Yevgeny Prigozhin. The Russian president expressed his condolences to the families of the 10 people who died in Prigozhin's private plane, said he had known the Wagner boss for a long time and that he'd made serious mistakes in his life, but praised him for, and I quote, making a significant contribution to our common cause, the fight against Nazism in Ukraine. Meanwhile, US intelligence reports suggest Prigozhin's aircraft was not brought down by a surface-to-air missile. One early theory is there could have been a bomb on board, but US officials say they've come to no firm conclusions. Well, let's talk to a man who used to run US intelligence, the former CIA director, David Petraeus. General, good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much. What do you make of this latest information coming out of the Pentagon that for all the conspiracy theories about there being Prigozhin maybe switching planes, agreeing to disappear, he actually was on board and he was killed?
Well, I think it was pretty straightforward. Putin eventually was going to exact retribution on Prigozhin, who was a creature of his making, of course. Again, remember, he discovered him on the streets of St. Petersburg after Prigozhin got out of jail and was essentially running a hot dog stand. He then had a restaurant, then that led to catering contracts with the military and on until he was the financier and the organizer of the Wagner group, which proved so useful to Russian foreign policy in places like Syria, North Africa, and West Africa, and still is very useful to those. And I'm sure that they have sorted through how it is that they're going to have elements that continue to do that, whether they are the remnants of the Wagner group under new leadership, noting that, of course, it wasn't just Prigozhin on the plane, it was also the senior military commander of Wagner as well, and also several of the other leaders. And noting that the Ministry of Defense in recent weeks has been fostering the establishment of additional private military companies, presumably to fill any void that might result from this particular eventuality. One of my successors at the CIA has famously said, and he was, of course, the ambassador to Moscow and knows Putin well, said that Putin is one of those who believes that revenge is a dish best eaten cold. And it took a couple of months, but eventually you knew that there had to be an open window or an umbrella with a tip with his name on it, or in this case, perhaps an explosive placed on a plane. But Putin could not allow that blatant challenge by Prigozhin, even given that Prigozhin had eventually backed down, had come to his senses, turned the column around that was en route to Moscow within a couple hundred miles of it. That could not be allowed to stand. And I think what they were trying to do is sort out how do we make sure that we don't lose the capabilities that the Wagner group provided to us outside of Russian soil and also now no longer on Ukrainian soil, where we should remember the Wagner group achieved the only, quote, victory during the Russian winter offensive when it took Bakhmut at a horrific cost. Something I think, by the way, that probably had to weigh on Prigozhin, the sheer casualties that his forces experienced. Remember the videos of him excoriating those in Moscow living the high life while he and his men were out there fighting and dying for the Federation, surrounded by all of these corpses very clearly on the ground around him.
Is that what drove him to lose his head? I use those words very deliberately, given that he was very well aware of President Putin, that his leader liked to taste revenge cold, and that he had never allowed people to get away with this kind of thing before.
Well, I think what really drove the final actions that were the catalyst that drove Prigozhin literally to madness to launch this crazed coup attempt were the directives from the Ministry of Defense that cut off the contracts that were funding a lot of the Wagner group activities in Ukraine in particular, and then also issued an edict that by the end of that particular month, all standard elements, if you will, but particularly the Wagner group, had to sign on with the Russian Ministry of Defense, had to sign contracts as regular soldiers. Something, by the way, the Wagner group soldiers probably did not welcome because they got paid better by the Wagner group. And I think they saw themselves as a bit of more elite force than the regular Russian army forces. But this was an existential threat for him. But it also was the culmination of enormous grievances that he was expressing with respect to the Minister of Defense, the Chief of the General Staff, neither of whom he felt supported the Wagner group adequately. You'll remember his pleas for more ammunition, more weapon systems, more troops, et cetera, whatever. They gave him access to the prisons. Remember, he was able to go in and recruit prisoners. And, if you survived 9 months, I think it was, then you could actually go home a free man. Of course, they used him as cannon fodder, and their life expectancy turned out to be pretty short. But all of these factors, I think, came together. And I think it just boiled over for Putin, or for Prigozhin.
But if Prigozhin was so useful to Putin, whether it was in Ukraine or in Syria or in several African countries, wouldn't it have been easier and more elegant to got rid of Shoigu, the defense minister, or the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov?
Well, no. And first of all, they have been absolutely loyal to Putin. Prigozhin obviously was not. But, at some point, Prigozhin crossed the line. As someone who follows this very, very closely, does a nightly update together with the team here in Washington on what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, it's really we were starting to ask, when is this going to be too much? Obviously, the final step was too much. And then I think the ultimate result was somewhat inevitable. So this also, I should just note, this really seems to solidify the Russian Federation really as a mob state or a mob organization, even more than it already was. This is so blatant. It's so obvious. It was so expected. But Putin had to show that he is the ultimate power. And again, Shoigu, however many his failings, let's keep in mind that he's a creature of Putin as well. He was elevated to the Ministry of Defense. He wears a military uniform with all kinds of decorations, even though he never served a day in the military in his life. And then Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, who seemingly was this brilliant military mind back when he was introducing hybrid warfare and so forth in the wake of the 2014 seizure of Crimea with the Little Green Men, and then the support for the separatists in southeastern Ukraine known as the Donbass. His reputation obviously has been very tarnished, but they have remained loyal to Putin. They've kept their heads down. They're just trying to continue the mission, however challenging that is, and it is very, very challenging. By the way, one other irony here that has been overshadowed by all the news about Prigozhin is that Surovikin, who was the commander of forces in Ukraine for a period of time until Gerasimov took over, largely was responsible for establishing this very formidable defense that the Ukrainians are having such a difficult time cracking. This is the first real demonstration of great professional military expertise by the Russians after repeated failures, whether it was the Battle of Kyiv or Kharkiv or Sumy, Chernihiv, Kherson, you name it. But they established a very impressive defense in depth, many layers to it, very extensive anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, Dragon's Teeth, trench lines, all the rest of that. But for all of his efforts, because he got too close to Prigozhin and was seen on that fateful day as acceding to, or at least tolerating what Prigozhin was doing, certainly not standing in the way of it. He ultimately had to be banished as well, and he was.
One wonders how many other people like him are there in the Kremlin who may have found Prigozhin a little arrogant, but thought he was a real fighter, was prosecuting the war. He was useful. Look at this quote from a Russian war blogger called Roman Saponkov, who said the assassination of Prigozhin will have disastrous consequences. The people who gave this order do not understand the mood in the army and morale at all.
There's a lot to that, actually. And you'll have seen also that there was a two-star general who commanded quite an impressive force, very charismatic leader, great call sign, and all of this stuff. He was dismissed because he complained to the higher command that he didn't have enough counter-fire radar. He didn't have enough of other weapons systems and capabilities. I think all legitimate complaints, but this is not an army in which the transmission goes up. It typically only goes down. You may recall, actually, back in the USSR days, when I was a young officer and we were on the front lines of freedom during the Cold War and the inter-German border and so forth, at least according to our intelligence analysis, some of the radios could only transmit down. You could only receive at the end. You couldn't transmit back. And I think that just sort of whether true or not, it was a representation of the culture of top-down leadership and really quite harsh top-down leadership in the Russian army as well. And of course, the big question right now about this Russian defense is really about the Russian soldiers who do endure this kind of.
Well, that's going to be the big question, isn't it?